The Storm Command Center pulsed with noise and urgency, radar screens flashing, red radios crackling with frantic updates. Officers huddled over monitors while a hurricane roared toward the coast, pushing timelines to the edge of collapse. And in the middle of it all, a silver-haired woman in a scuffed leather jacket and worn jeans calmly stepped forward. Her voice cut through the clamor like a blade through fog. "I can fly it." No preamble, no bravado, just 5 words spoken with such matter-of-fact certainty that the room went still for half a second. Then came the laughter. It started with a short chuckle from one corner, then rolled across the room like thunder breaking loose. Pilots in flight suits leaned back, shaking their heads, exchanging looks that said, this had to be a joke. A few even clapped mockingly, amused at the idea of someone's grandmother volunteering to fly into a Category 5 storm. One officer turned away, trying to hide a grin. Another leaned in to whisper something snide to a colleague. No one took her seriously. Why would they? Ellie Turner didn't flinch. She stood there, her shoulders steady, her expression unreadable. The overhead lights caught the edge of an old scar on her cheek, the only thing hinting at a life lived outside ordinary boundaries. Her boots were muddy from the tarmac. Her hands were calloused. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a machine shop, not into one of the most high-security operations centers on the East Coast. Major Derek Stone let out the loudest laugh. He was tall, square-jawed, the kind of man who filled a room without even trying. He looked down at her like she'd offered to launch a rocket with a broomstick. He was still smirking when he asked her if she had any idea what she was volunteering for. His voice had the tone of a man used to being the smartest person in the room. Ellie met his eyes without blinking. There was no anger in her gaze, no need to defend herself, only the kind of stillness that unsettled people used to noise and motion, the kind of stillness that held history. The general hadn't spoken yet. She was watching from behind a long operations table, her brow slightly furrowed. Around her, the staff shifted uneasily. They didn't know who this woman was or how she'd gotten clearance to stand in this room, let alone speak with that kind of confidence. Outside, the storm howled louder, shaking the walls like a warning. They were almost out of time. Everyone in that room knew it. Still, no one moved. No one stepped forward. Only Ellie, hands at her sides, waiting for someone to take her seriously. The room hadn't figured it out yet. But something was shifting. The laughter would be the last they'd share that day. Because in that single moment, under flickering lights and a sky about to split open, Ellie Turner didn't just offer to fly a mission. She set the whole truth in motion. And nothing would be the same after that. Part 1. Sympathy Buildup. The Simple Woman Who Fixed Planes. The sky was still dark when Ellie Turner stepped out of the rental car and closed the door with a quiet click. The air was heavy with coastal humidity, thick and warm, clinging to her worn denim jeans and long-sleeved shirt. Her boots scuffed softly against the pavement as she made her way toward the security checkpoint at Charleston Air Force Base. She didn't walk fast. There was no rush in her steps, no sign she felt the need to impress anyone. Her leather jacket was old, creased from years of wear, and the weathered canvas bag slung over her shoulder looked like it had been through every kind of job a mechanic might take on. At the gate, a young security specialist barely looked up from his clipboard as she handed over her ID. His eyes skimmed her clothes, then her face, and settled into a polite blankness that bordered on disinterest. She was just another civilian contractor, one more older woman with clearance papers, and the kind of tired patience that said she'd spent a lifetime getting things done without asking for much. He handed her a visitor badge with the kind of automatic courtesy you give someone who won't be sticking around long. She clipped it onto her jacket and thanked him with a quiet nod. As she turned to head toward Building 7, her eyes flicked up toward the distant hangars, where the silhouettes of massive C-17s loomed like sleeping giants. She didn't stare. She scanned. Subtle, but unmistakable. Her gaze moved the way a surgeon might check vitals, or a composer listens for the first out-of-place note. One of the planes had a patch near its tail that didn't match the paint perfectly. Another had a hydraulic cable, sagging just slightly lower than it should. Details most people would miss. Ellie didn't miss them. A maintenance sergeant stood smoking just outside the coordination office, arms crossed and face hard with the usual skepticism reserved for outsiders. He took one look at Ellie and frowned like someone being asked to explain their work to a school librarian. She greeted him with a small smile and asked where to report. He didn't answer right away. just nodded toward the entrance and muttered something about civilians always showing up when they're least needed. Inside the office buzzed with clipped voices and the sharp scent of fuel and oil. Ellie waited at the back of the room, not drawing attention. She watched as teams hurried in and out, moving parts, clipboards, equipment. She knew the rhythm. It was the same everywhere. Organized chaos masking deeper problems. A younger tech brushed past her and glanced down at her boots. He smirked, then turned back to his task. Ellie didn't react. She just stepped quietly aside and kept watching. In her bag, the metal corners of her credentials pressed against her palm. They'd call her a consultant, which was true in name only. The real weight of her history was buried far beneath that laminated plastic. She was here for a reason, and it wasn't just to check torque specs. She knew the difference between minor wear and fatal shortcuts. She could smell burnt fluid before a machine even shut down. The smell clung to a section of the bay they walked past. She paused for half a second and tilted her head slightly. That wasn't normal exhaust. Something had overheated recently. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Not until she saw more. When Master Sergeant Valdez finally showed up, he looked like a man who had seen too many parts fail and too few people care. He gave her the once-over and barely hid his surprise. She didn't match the expert he expected, but she offered her hand anyway and asked about the aircraft he wanted her to inspect. He sighed and led her toward a hangar, muttering about how these planes weren't museum pieces and didn't need old-school mechanics poking around. Ellie just listened. She'd heard it all before. The assumptions, the dismissal, the quiet disrespect wrapped in polite professionalism. The wind picked up outside as they reached the open hangar doors. Inside stood a C-17 being prepped for a mission. Ellie stopped for a moment and looked up at it. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes sharpened. It wasn't awe. It was recognition. Like seeing an old friend who had aged but was still strong beneath the surface. She approached the aircraft with quiet purpose. Her fingers brushed lightly along the fuselage as she walked past, as if checking its heartbeat. Something in her face changed. Just a flicker. A memory, maybe. Or a quiet promise she intended to keep. She didn't need to prove anything. Not yet. But the plane would remember her touch. And soon, so would everyone else. Part 2. Rising Conflict. Hidden Truth. Sub-Part 2.1 Inspections and Whispers. The maintenance bay was cool and loud, filled with the echo of metal tools and tired voices. Ellie followed Master Sergeant Valdez past rows of equipment and stacked parts toward the C-17 parked beneath the overhead lights. The aircraft loomed above them, its size never failing to impress, even after all these years. Valdez explained the inspection log in quick, practiced sentences, pointing out which systems had been flagged and what had already been checked. Ellie nodded without interrupting. Her eyes moved faster than her steps, sweeping the structure with a gaze that knew where danger liked to hide. The first thing she noticed was a slight ripple near the wing root. Hairline stress fractures, faint and barely visible. Not something you'd catch if you weren't looking hard. She didn't mention it out loud. Not yet. They climbed the service ladder and stepped onto the aircraft's internal platform. The inside smelled of rubber and solvent with that unmistakable tinge of ozone from recent electrical work. Ellie let Valdez talk while she drifted toward the engine mount bay. She crouched beside one of the torque brackets and ran her fingers along the bolts. The paint marks were fresh. Too fresh. Someone had retorqued this section recently or made it look like they had. But the markings were uneven. She felt it before she even tested it. One of the safety wires was missing. Another had been threaded in reverse. These were small mistakes to most people. But in aviation, small mistakes stack like dominoes. Valdez shifted behind her, watching. She asked when this section had been signed off. He glanced at the clipboard and said last week. Ellie nodded, then stood slowly, her knees reminding her of every year she'd spent on hard tarmac. Her face didn't change, but inside a knot began to tighten. This wasn't random sloppiness. It felt like a pattern. She moved toward the rear fuselage and pulled open the access panel to the auxiliary hydraulics. A valve was tagged as replaced. The serial number on the tag didn't match the log entry. Someone was cycling parts that had already passed their use limit. That was the second red flag. Her mind wandered for just a moment. 6 months ago, her son's transport had gone down over the Atlantic. The investigation called it an equipment failure. No one could explain what had failed, only that it was fast and final. She'd sat through the official statements and watched the officers fumble through technical language they barely understood. Now here she was standing in a different hangar miles from the crash site looking at the same carelessness, same shortcuts, same signatures. She touched the edge of a bulkhead and felt a faint vibration. It was subtle, barely there, but not supposed to happen in a grounded plane. Something inside the structure was loose. She didn't need tools to know that. She could feel it in her hands. Valdez pointed toward another system down the line, talking about clearance rates and man-hours saved. Ellie smiled thinly and asked if she could see the last 5 maintenance logs. He hesitated, said most of them were already filed. She asked again, her voice light but firm. He relented. She flipped through them with slow care. The same names popped up, same checklists marked complete in under 3 hours. No way the inspections had been that fast unless corners were cut or someone wasn't looking close enough. Or maybe they were told not to. The silence between them stretched. Valdez asked if she saw anything that concerned her. She said she'd seen things worth reviewing. He nodded and walked off, his back stiff. Not angry, not exactly afraid either, but uncomfortable, like he knew she wasn't here just to check boxes. Ellie stayed a while longer. The hangar lights buzzed overhead and she felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders. This wasn't about one aircraft. It wasn't about routine negligence. This was systemic, and someone had paid the price. Her son's voice flickered in her memory. The last call, the excitement in his words. He had trusted the machine, trusted the people who cleared it for flight. That trust had killed him. She placed the logbook down with quiet care, aligning it on the table without a sound. Her fingers rested on the cover for a moment longer than needed. Her jaw clenched, but nothing showed in her face. They thought she was here to offer a second opinion. She was here to find the truth. She turned toward the next aircraft on the list, the weight in her chest building with every step. If the patterns held, she already knew what she'd find. But she needed proof, real, irrefutable, undeniable evidence. No one was going to bury this with jargon and excuses. Not this time. Sub-Part 2.2, a familiar signature. The maintenance office was quiet when Ellie slipped in the fluorescent lights, casting a cold glow over rows of files and thick binders. She waited until the last technician stepped out for a coffee break before moving toward the cabinet marked Operations Clearance. Her hand hovered over the drawer for a second, then pulled it open with a soft clunk. The folders were labeled by tail number, and she scanned until she found the one that matched the aircraft from the earlier inspection. She carried it to the back table, opened the cover, and flipped through the pages with practiced calm. Her eyes skimmed torque values, inspection cycles, replacement part logs. Most of it looked official, but something kept catching her eye. Too many entries had been closed in under a few hours, signatures repeated across multiple reports in the same handwriting. Then she saw it. In black ink at the bottom of a clearance page was a name that froze her hands. D. Stone, Major, Flight Ops Authorization. The air felt thinner in her lungs. She stared at the signature, her heart slowing, then speeding up all at once. The handwriting was the same one she remembered from the investigation binder. She hadn't forgotten. It had shown up in the final inspection report of the aircraft her son died in. She sat back in the chair and held the page in both hands. The report said the aircraft had passed all safety checks 2 weeks before it went down. She hadn't questioned it at the time. Not beyond the usual grief. Not beyond the quiet ache that something hadn't felt right. Now she knew what was wrong. The numbers on this report didn't match the wear and tear she'd seen on the plane that morning. Valdez had claimed it had passed structural stress tests, but the frame had clear signs of fatigue, the same kind her son's crash report had tried to call unforeseeable. She flipped back through the binder and found another signature. Same pen, same stroke. Major Derek Stone had cleared this aircraft, and the one before it, and almost certainly her son's. She stared at the name again, letting the reality sink in. Her mind replayed the sequence of failure in David's crash report. Engine torque inconsistencies, improper bolt tension, safety wire missing in the aft coupling system, all listed as anomalies impossible to predict. Except they weren't. They were patterns, the same ones she had seen all morning. Sloppy maintenance passed off as routine, and now she was holding the name of the man who had let it happen. She closed the file and rested her hands on the table. Her fingers twitched once, but she took a breath and steadied herself. Grief pressed against her chest like a weight, but underneath it, something older stirred, something sharper than sadness. She had given decades to aircraft safety. She had taught engineers who now ran departments. She had flown machines long before some of these officers had even seen combat. And yet no one here had asked her real opinion. They hadn't expected her to notice. She opened her own bag and pulled out a folded photocopy of the report from David's crash. She'd kept it all this time tucked between old journals and training notes, not because she needed to be reminded, but because part of her had always known. She laid it beside the file she found today. The match was undeniable. The same anomalies, the same signatures, the same excuses. She sat still for a long moment, letting the betrayal settle. This wasn't about missed inspections or overworked crews. This was someone choosing to ignore safety to save time. Someone who cared more about numbers on a readiness report than lives inside the fuselage. She thought of David again, his wide grin the last time they spoke. How proud he was to be part of something bigger than himself. He trusted the system. She had taught him to trust it. And that trust had killed him. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her breathing steady. If she let the anger take over, she'd miss the details. And right now, the details mattered more than ever. She gathered the pages and returned them to the folder, careful to keep everything in the same order. She didn't want anyone to know what she had seen. Not yet. She needed more. More patterns. More connections. But now she had a name, a face, a target. She stepped out of the office and into the corridor, the hum of machinery in the background like static in her ears. The world hadn't changed yet. But it would. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it began with a quiet moment in a room full of paper, and sometimes it started with a mother staring at the signature of the man who helped cover up the death of her son. Ellie didn't walk faster. She didn't need to. Her mission had just shifted. She wasn't here to assist anymore. She was here to expose. Part 3. The Decision Point. Subpart 3.1. The Mission Proposal. The operations center buzzed with rising tension as fresh data rolled in from the storm track. Hurricane Darla had strengthened overnight, gaining speed and force, and was now just hours from making landfall. The situation had gone from critical to near impossible in minutes. General Hayes stood at the center of the room, her face tight as a meteorologist laid out the grim forecast. Sustained winds were over 140 miles per hour, with a projected impact zone that now included 2 forward operating bases. Communications were failing. Time was slipping away fast. A junior officer rushed to her side, handing over an updated logistics report. 60 personnel and a dozen armored tanks were stranded at FOB Ranger, with no other aircraft capable of making the trip in time. If they weren't evacuated soon, they would be trapped in the heart of the storm. Major Stone stepped forward, his voice calm and full of the usual confidence. He said his crew could handle it, said they'd flown worse missions, said the C-17 could handle the load. He was already outlining the route before anyone else had spoken. Ellie stood near the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, listening to every word. She knew which aircraft Stone planned to use. She had walked under its wings, touched the engine mounts, read the falsified inspection logs with his signature. Panic curled in her gut like ice. She knew that plane was compromised. The stress fractures were real. The torque values had been altered. The safety measures had been ignored. And now he wanted to push it through hurricane force winds with 60 lives on board. Dr. Amanda Walsh. One of the flight engineers tried to raise concerns about the aircraft's performance under extreme conditions. Her voice was measured, her points technical. But Stone brushed her off, calling it acceptable risk. Called it a calculated gamble. Ellie couldn't look away. Her heart was pounding. She had seen these exact words used before. The same logic had cleared her son's aircraft. The same arrogance had sent it into the sky. Her mind raced. Should she speak now? Should she step forward and say what she knew? But she had no official role. She was a civilian, just a consultant, and they'd already laughed at her once. Stone kept talking now, addressing the general directly. Said his team was on standby. Said they could launch within 2 hours. His confidence filled the room like smoke, choking out doubt before it had time to settle. Ellie watched General Hayes hesitate. The woman was under pressure from every angle. She needed results. She needed leadership. Stone was offering both. The pit in Ellie's stomach grew deeper. This wasn't a gamble anymore. It was a loaded gun, and no one else could see it. She looked down at the notepad in her hand. The scribbled part numbers, the torque discrepancies, the date of David's crash circled twice. This wasn't theory. It was déjà vu, playing out exactly the same way, only this time she was in the room. Her breathing tightened. She thought of the families of those 60 soldiers, the faces of the crew loading tanks they expected to survive with. She thought of how David had smiled the day before his mission, trusting the system, believing in the people around him. She clenched the pen so hard it snapped in two. Around her, the conversation grew louder. Officers debated flight paths, debated risk windows, and reviewed payload math. Stone's voice cut through it all like a drill, confident, sharp, rehearsed. Ellie wanted to scream. She wanted to shout that the aircraft wasn't safe, that Stone had lied, that they were all seconds away from repeating a deadly mistake. But she stayed still. Because she didn't just want to stop one bad mission, she wanted to end the entire pattern. She needed evidence, real proof, something they couldn't ignore or wave away. She looked toward the hangar in the distance. The storm clouds were darker now, the wind pressing hard against the windows. Nature didn't wait for decisions. It would come whether they were ready or not. Her eyes returned to Stone. He was smiling now, shaking hands, already acting like a hero. He had no idea what she knew, no idea how close he was to being exposed. Ellie took a step back, then another. She needed time, just enough to pull one more thread. But if no one stopped this launch, those men wouldn't survive. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from the weight of what she had to choose. Say nothing, and let the mission proceed. Speak too soon and lose her only shot at proving the truth. David's name whispered in her mind, and suddenly the choice was clear. She couldn't let another mother bury a child because no one was willing to stand up. Her voice wasn't ready yet, but it would be, soon. Because if Major Stone went through with this mission, Ellie Turner would be waiting. And this time she wouldn't be silent. Subpart 3.2, I can fly it. The operations center was on edge. The hurricane's outer bands were now minutes from hitting the coast, and decisions had to be made fast. General Hayes stood over the mission board, eyes narrowed while Major Stone paced beside her like a man already accepting applause. Another officer called out updated wind speeds. The numbers weren't good. No other options were being presented. Stone was confident. Too confident. Ellie Turner stood near the back arms at her sides, silent until now. She took one breath and stepped forward. The room didn't notice at first, but her voice reached across the chaos, clear and calm. I can fly it. The pause that followed was short, but heavy, a second of confusion. Then it happened. Laughter. It started near the comm station and spread fast. Pilots chuckled, some outright laughed, the kind of laughter that cuts, harsh, dismissive, and sharp. Someone muttered that Grandma had lost her mind. A tech leaned against a table smirking. Even General Hayes glanced over, unsure if she had heard right. And Stone, standing tall with arms crossed, let out a full laugh. He turned toward Ellie, smiling like he was watching someone try to perform magic with a wrench. He asked if she was serious, if she understood what was involved. His voice dripped with condescension. This wasn't a training flight. This was a full-load evac through the eye of a Category 5 storm. Ellie didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a worn leather folder, and calmly placed a card on the edge of the operations desk. The closest sergeant stepped forward to grab it, thinking it was more consultant ID paperwork. Then her screen lit up. For a second, she just stared at the data. Then her eyes widened. She turned toward General Hayes and said something quietly, something that changed the atmosphere instantly. The laughter faded as fast as it had started. All at once, the air in the room shifted. The screen behind the comms desk lit up with a clearance code most had never seen. Thunder Protocol, classification above clearance level, authorization Executive Flight Authority. General Hayes took a slow step toward the desk. She picked up the card Ellie had set down. Her expression changed. Confusion gave way to surprise, then to something deeper. Recognition. Ellie stood straighter, the tension gone from her shoulders. Her voice held no anger, no pride, just certainty. She said she had experience with C-17s, said she had logged flight hours in systems they hadn't even trained on yet. Major Stone looked frozen. He asked again who she was. The words came out tight now, not mocking, defensive. Ellie turned to him calm as ever. She said the name, Thunder 7, her call sign. The room went completely still. She didn't have to explain it. Those two words traveled through the crowd like a wave. A few of the senior officers looked stunned. One young pilot whispered that Thunder 7 was a ghost, a name from old test pilot rumors, a legend. Now she was standing in front of them wearing boots covered in hangar dust asking to fly. General Hayes walked around the desk and looked Ellie in the eye. She didn't smile. She didn't question it. Instead, she asked what she needed. Ellie nodded once and asked for meteorological data, cargo weight specs, and a crew that would follow orders. Her voice never raised. She didn't gloat. She just worked. Major Stone stepped back like the ground had shifted. He tried to say something about protocol, about safety, but the words came apart in his mouth. No one was listening to him anymore. Every head had turned, every eye was on Ellie. Because now they knew. This wasn't just a retired mechanic. This was the person who wrote the flight manuals they trained from. The one who flew into storms before some of them could read. The woman who once tested aircraft that didn't exist on record. And now she was about to do it again, with lives on the line, with time running out. No one laughed after that. Part 4. Proving herself in the storm. Subpart 4.1 Into the Eye. Ellie stood on the tarmac, face calm against the rising wind. The storm clouds above churned in dark layers, casting everything in shades of steel. Behind her, crews moved with urgency, checking restraints, recalibrating cargo weight, and strapping down anything that might shift under violent turbulence. She moved along the aircraft like it was an old friend. Her hands skimmed along the fuselage, her eyes catching every bolt, every seam. One of the younger mechanics stood nearby, unsure whether to offer help or stay out of the way. She simply nodded at the checklist in his hand, confirming she'd already memorized the critical load points. Inside the cockpit, Ellie adjusted the pilot seat with a few slow turns. Her fingers moved over the controls like a pianist testing the keys of a grand piano. Every motion was practiced but not mechanical. She wasn't just operating the plane, she was listening to it. Her co-pilot, a nervous lieutenant assigned last minute, watched her with quiet disbelief. She didn't need to explain anything. He watched her double-check manual settings, override the autopilot, and toggle radar sweep zones that others rarely used. Each move she made wasn't standard. It was intentional. Ground control came through the headset with final clearance. Ellie replied with a voice steady as the earth. No nerves, no bravado, just clear confidence. Engines roared as she eased the C-17 forward. The rain started before she even left the taxiway. Sheets of water hammered the windshield and wind gusts rocked the plane even on the ground. Still, Ellie didn't hesitate. The tower warned her of sheer pockets ahead. She acknowledged and adjusted thrust by 2%. The crew in the tower exchanged looks. No one else did that on takeoff. She was compensating for predicted lateral drift. Before it happened. As the aircraft lifted, Ellie eased it upward into a vertical slice between crosswinds, riding the vector like she was threading a needle. Her jaw stayed loose. Her eyes focused. The co-pilot's hands hovered over controls but never moved. He knew she was beyond him. They entered the storm wall 15 minutes in. Turbulence hit like fists, but Ellie didn't flinch. She pulled back slightly, then trimmed pitch until the plane rode the updraft instead of fighting it. The frame groaned once, then leveled. Inside the cargo bay, the tanks groaned against their straps. The loadmaster radioed that all tie-downs were holding. Ellie answered with a quiet acknowledgement and adjusted altitude by 30 feet to follow a smoother air corridor she knew would be there, because she'd flown this kind of storm before. Not in this plane, but with others years ago, when no one was watching, when her job was to fly what couldn't be flown. Lightning split the clouds ahead. The light filled the cockpit for a flash, showing Ellie's face calm and focused, her hands moving without wasted motion. The co-pilot finally asked how she knew which way to lean the controls just before each hit. She said she could hear it, in the pitch of the engines, in the sound of the pressure change around the fuselage, and she meant it. They reached the outer ring of the hurricane's eye faster than expected. Ellie dropped airspeed just enough to align with a narrow gap in the system. It was only there for seconds, but she caught it, slipped through, and found the calm. The eye was unreal. Smooth light poured through a broken ring of clouds. Winds fell silent. Visibility stretched for miles. And below, the stranded tanks sat like forgotten toys on a flooded runway, their crews scrambling to prepare for extraction. The tower at the forward base called in disbelief. They hadn't expected anyone to make it. Ellie lined up her descent without ceremony, adjusting weight distribution in real time with minimal flaps. No one taught that maneuver, but it let her settle the massive transport with a gentleness that stunned even the ground team watching from the field. As the wheels kissed the earth, one of the tank commanders standing nearby lowered his binoculars, unable to believe what he had seen. He hadn't expected a woman, let alone one old enough to be his mother, to step out of the cockpit, but she did. Ellie didn't waste time. She coordinated loading with crisp orders and fast decisions. She reviewed balance loads on the fly. She caught a misaligned ramp setting in seconds. Her presence quieted the chaos without needing to raise her voice. The storm was closing in fast, and she knew they only had one shot. As the last tank was secured, she walked the bay herself, checking every restraint. When she got back to the cockpit, she gave a simple nod, and they were airborne again. The return flight was harder. The eye had closed. Now they were flying blind. But Ellie's voice on the radio stayed steady. She called out course corrections with seconds to spare. She read the movement of the clouds like someone reading lines off a page. At Charleston, the tower gave her priority clearance. Pilots gathered in the observation room, watching radar as Thunder 7 approached. No one spoke. They just listened. Ellie landed with such precision that the wheels barely chirped on contact. The aircraft taxied clean, every system in check. The evac had been successful. 60 lives saved, 12 tanks delivered, 1 storm defied. And Ellie. She shut down the engines with quiet fingers, looked out the window for a moment, then stood up slowly, the ache in her knees. Forgotten. The co-pilot just watched her, not sure what to say. He didn't have to. Everyone who had watched knew. She didn't just fly the mission. She owned it. Subpart 4.2, coming back with proof. The moment the wheels touched down at Charleston, Ellie eased the brakes with practiced control. The massive aircraft slowed smoothly, engines humming low as the storm pressed at the hangars in the distance. Her voice came through the radio, calm and crisp, confirming touchdown and requesting immediate access to flight maintenance records. The crew began unloading. Teams moved fast under the threat of worsening winds. But Ellie didn't leave the cockpit. She stayed seated for a moment, her hands resting on the throttles, her eyes fixed ahead. The mission was over, but hers wasn't. She stepped down from the aircraft, bypassing the officers approaching to thank her. She spoke quietly to one technician, asking him to bring her the maintenance binder for the plane they had flown. He hesitated, unsure, until she showed her credentials again. Then he moved fast. She waited by the nose of the C-17, eyes tracking the faint line of rain rolling in. Her heart was steady. No rage, no grief, just the sharp edge of purpose. The binder landed in her hands, thick and slightly damp. She flipped it open and scanned the entries with surgical focus. The same names, the same rushed signatures, and the same codes that had appeared in the report from her son's fatal crash. Torque values that had been manually corrected. Component serials swapped without matching installation records. Safety wire fields left blank and later filled in different handwriting. It was all there. She turned the page and found it. D. Stone. Maintenance authorization. Final clearance signed off 2 days before the flight. Her fingers tightened around the binder. She walked straight into the operations building, heading for the mission debrief. Stone was already there, standing in front of a cluster of officers, retelling the mission as if it had been his own. His voice was smooth, his body language relaxed, until he saw her. She didn't stop walking. She stepped into the room and placed the binder on the table. She asked for General Hayes. Someone tried to speak, but she lifted a hand, silencing the room with a single look. Then she turned to Stone. Her voice was low, controlled. She said the aircraft he approved was not airworthy. She pointed to the entries and listed each violation, her tone clinical. Stone tried to interrupt, but she kept going. She described each discrepancy with precision, comparing it to the patterns from David's crash report. He said it was within tolerance, that standards had changed, but his voice cracked, his shoulders shifted. He knew. Ellie didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice once. She simply stated the truth, that this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a pattern of decisions made to cut corners, hide problems, and push aircraft into flight without proper clearance, and people had died for it. She looked him in the eye and said her son was one of them. The room went still. General Hayes arrived, drawn by the quiet tension. Ellie handed over the binder. Her hands didn't shake. She explained that the documentation matched what she had seen months ago. The records had been manipulated. The logs had been falsified. And the man responsible was standing in that room. Hayes opened the folder and scanned the pages. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The evidence was clear. The timeline, the signatures, the negligence. Ellie turned back to Stone. Her final words were simple. This aircraft is grounded, effective immediately. And you, Major, are relieved of duty. A security officer stepped forward without being asked. Stone backed away, sputtering, calling it a mistake. But no one came to his defense. He had been arrogant for too long. He had ignored too many warnings. And now the reckoning had come. They led him out in silence. Ellie remained still. Her face didn't show triumph. Just the quiet weight of something finished. The kind of justice that didn't come with cheers. Only relief. She turned to Hayes and said there were likely more records, more aircraft, more risks, and someone needed to clean it up before anyone else paid the price. The general nodded, promised action, promised accountability. Ellie didn't need the promise. She had done what she came to do. David's photo was still in her wallet, tucked behind her ID. She would visit his grave that weekend and tell him. Tell him the truth was no longer buried. Tell him the lies were over. She walked out of the room with slow, even steps, not lighter, not finished, but resolved. Because justice isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, unshaken. Just like her. Part 5, Consequences and Closure. Subpart 5.1, The Fall of Stone. Major Stone was led out of the operations center in cuffs, flanked by military police and watched by stunned officers who had once trusted him without question. No one spoke as he passed. The silence carried more weight than any accusation. The investigation moved quickly. Ellie's documentation was thorough, her comparisons airtight. Within 48 hours, a special review board was assembled to audit all aircraft Stone had cleared in the past year. They found more inconsistencies, more reports altered, more flights launched with systems that should have been grounded. The evidence was irrefutable, and for the first time in years, someone was finally held accountable. Stone was stripped of his rank and charged with falsifying military records, endangering lives, and obstruction of investigation. He wasn't the only one. Supervisors who had signed off without proper review were also suspended. Contractors who had cut corners were blacklisted. Ellie didn't gloat. She didn't return to the command center. Her role was never about revenge. It was about the truth. Military leadership issued a statement acknowledging systemic flaws in maintenance oversight. A new protocol was introduced under General Hayes's directive, one that required third-party audits, unannounced spot checks, and anonymous reporting channels for safety violations. The reform spread faster than expected. Bases across the country began reviewing their logs. Senior staff were ordered to retrain on technical compliance. For once, the system was doing what it should have done before her son died. Ellie was invited to speak at the Defense Safety Command. She declined the public spotlight but agreed to advise on structural reform. She offered real changes, small details only someone who had worked with their hands could understand. She made them listen. In private, a few officers came to thank her. One of them said their brother had flown a mission last month on a plane Stone had cleared, said he might not be here if Ellie hadn't spoken up. She accepted the thanks with quiet grace. It wasn't closure. That kind of loss doesn't close. But it was justice. The kind that makes space for healing. Major Stone's name was removed from the operations roster. His office was cleared. His legacy rewritten by the truth he tried to bury. And Ellie, she kept flying. Not missions, but truths. Into rooms that needed it most. Subpart 5.2, A Memorial in Motion. Ellie stood alone at the small hillside cemetery where her son was buried. The breeze was light that morning, carrying the scent of pine and distant sea air. She knelt beside the headstone and placed a single patch of his old flight unit on the ground, right where the sun touched the stone. For months, she'd carried the weight of not knowing what had really happened or if the truth would ever come out. Now she knew, and so did the people who needed to. The Defense Department had sent her a letter. Official commendation civilian bravery citation attached with a medal she hadn't asked for. She kept it in a drawer beside his photo, tucked away where it couldn't distract from what mattered more. It was never about awards. It was about what he stood for, about what he believed the system was supposed to protect. She had been invited to speak at the dedication of a new hangar named after him. She said yes, but kept her remarks short. She spoke about accountability, not heroics, about the cost of silence, and how repair isn't just about machines. It's about people willing to speak up when others look away. Afterward, a young mechanic approached her, said he'd thought about quitting, said he'd stayed because of her, because she reminded him that fixing things meant more than tightening bolts. It meant refusing to pretend when something was broken. Ellie thanked him and left before the cameras turned. She didn't need the moment captured. She just needed it to matter. At home, her tools were still organized the way they'd always been. Each socket, each wrench marked with the same tape she used in her early days. She still kept her boots by the door, still read service manuals with a pencil in hand. Some habits didn't change, and maybe they shouldn't. She thought about justice sometimes, how people expect it to feel big, loud, final. But the truth was, it usually comes quiet, through paper trails, long nights, and showing up again even when no one asks you to. Ellie never saw herself as brave, just stubborn enough to care when it counted. She didn't need a statue or a ceremony. She had a name cleared, a system changed, and her son's story told with honesty. That was enough. Sometimes the people who carry the most weight walk the quietest paths. They don't boast, they don't demand to be seen. They simply do what's right, even when the world doesn't believe they can. Ellie Turner never looked like a hero. She didn't wear a flight suit anymore, and time had etched her face with the years she gave to service. But in the moment that mattered most, she rose. Not for praise, not for revenge, but because someone had to fly straight into a storm and come back with the truth. Her story reminds us that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it moves with steady hands and a heart full of memory. Sometimes it stands back until the moment calls. They looked at her and saw a simple woman. But what they didn't see was the history in her steps, the experience in her silence, and the fire she carried behind her calm. They judged her by her age, but the skies remembered her name, Thunder 7. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that greatness isn't always loud. Like, subscribe, and help us keep telling the stories of those who rise quietly, but leave a mark that lasts forever.